pleasure of interviewing Seth Levine for season 1 of Jane's Place. Now I'm especially honored to be able to share this interview with Seth in advance of his new book release, Capital Evolution, written with co-author Elizabeth MacBride. The book is both an acknowledgement of our present and a hopeful look into our future. This interview is especially meaningful to me as Seth's firm, the Foundry Group, published my first, and so far my only, book in 2014. Listen in with me for Seth's insight and his analysis of the evolution of capitalism. So, Seth, next week, Capital Evolution is hitting the market. It's your newest book.
Finally.
After your last book, The New Builders. And so tell me a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it, what sort of the content is, and then I'll see what other questions I have for you.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you helping me get the word out about it. So Capital Evolution describes basically the evolution of capitalism. And it stemmed from some people asking me and my co-author, Elizabeth MacBride, a lot of questions about what's the role of business right now, right? What am I supposed, I'm a CEO of a business. There's all these things happening around me, socially, governmental, all this stuff happening. What am I supposed to be doing? What things do I comment on? What things are outside of my purview? And it got us thinking about, one, the rising power of business, right? Businesses are being asked to do more, especially as government sort of writ large has reduced in power. We can talk about sort of some of the more recent moves by the current administration to kind of gain power back. But government as a concept, really starting with Reagan, who said government was the enemy, right? It's been a deliberate attempt to diffuse the power of government over decades and decades and decades. And companies are now stepping in to fill that void, and consumers, people, are expecting companies now, and their leaders specifically, to talk about essentially every issue that's out there in a way that they were not expected to 20 or 30 years ago. And very importantly, the way that capitalism has worked over the last, let's say, 50 years, which is really the time period that comprised what we now call neoliberal capitalism, Friedman economics, the idea that shareholders are the only thing that company CEOs or company boards of directors need to worry about. That has not, it's worked in sort of an aggregate sense. It has not worked at all sort of across the board, right? And what we've seen is really an extractive form of capitalism. We extract from the environment, we extract from the middle class, we extract from workers. It's not sustainable. And I think that business leaders have recognized this. In 2019, the Business Roundtable, then led by Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, they came out with an updated purpose of a corporation. And they said, well, wait a minute, actually, companies should be thinking about not just their shareholders, but other stakeholders, their employees, their suppliers, their communities, the environment. And slowly, that started to, in fits and starts, started to take hold across the business community, I think in ways that people maybe didn't recognize. And we wanted to write about exactly that, right? So this is really a book that talks about the transition from neoliberal capitalism to whatever is next. We name it, we call it dynamic capitalism, which is the idea of capitalism that is more responsive, is more nimble, has other stakeholders, is still profit-oriented, right? Shareholders are still a stakeholder in all businesses, but recognizes that we cannot keep treating all of these resources, again, environment, workers, and the middle class, as extractive resources. We can't just keep taking from them. And so that's the idea behind the book. We trace a lot of stories. We interviewed a ton of not just CEOs like Jamie Dimon. We got a bunch of time with him and Dick Parsons before he passed away, Lisa Green Hall from Apollo Global, a lot of really, Dan Schulman from PayPal, a lot of really interesting CEOs, but we also interviewed a bunch of academics. We interviewed a bunch of people who are sort of at various levels in the sort of the workplace hierarchy, workers all the way down to people who are on the floor, on the shop floor, to get different perspectives about how capitalism is working and is not working, and maybe what we could do to change it. And so it's not a policy book, but we do have some specific ideas for things that we should lean into. It's also a bit of a defense of capitalism, right? If you ask people who are under 40, the majority of them don't think capitalism works. And they would abandon it not clear exactly what they would abandon it for. And for me, I'm a venture capitalist, so I'm a capitalist by job title. But I believe capitalism is the best economic system for supporting innovation, change, growth, and ultimately lifting as many people as possible into better circumstances. There is no other system that I think works in the same way and with the same power and with the same breadth. And so I wanted to also, along with Elizabeth, defend capitalism a little bit, talk about the pieces of capitalism that are really important and are driving those sort of powerful change agents, and recognize that there are some aspects of capitalism that perhaps need to change and that we can change them.
First of all, I think it's amazing to have that stat about people under 40, and I think, and sort of how we think about the world. And I love the idea of dynamic capitalism as sort of the next thing to go to. Are there a couple of companies or leaders that you say that are at the forefront of this, that are sort of leading the charge that we should be following, watching, as a CEO myself, and trying to sort of understand how I am more of a thought leader and really sort of being on the front of the curve versus just a follower? Who should I be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, so the truth is there are a lot of them, right? And many of them are names that you haven't heard of, right? They're people that are running mid-sized businesses, and they're doing things to enable and empower their workers or provide for more employee ownership, which is something we talk a lot about in the book. It's just a really powerful way to, in our minds, create more capitalists, and really kind of maybe better balance what used to be a lot of revenue going to workers and now is a lot of revenue going to profits, right? So let's find other ways to make people part of that ownership class so they can share in those profits. So there's lots of people doing that, but there's a couple of names that you would have heard of that we talk to in the book and talk about in the book. Jamie is one of them, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan. He does a nice job of kind of describing where the line is between living values and being overtly political,
right.
Which I think he sometimes struggles with, but he had a lot of interesting things to say about that. Dan Schulman, who's now moved away from PayPal, but looking back on his time at PayPal, did some really interesting things to change the nature of how they supported their workforce after he realized that he literally had employees selling plasma to make ends meet and decided that, and they were paying at or above industry pay scales. And he said to us very directly, I thought that meant we were doing fine. And after I really looked at it, I realized that that's not the measure. The measure needs to be, can people afford the things that they need to afford? And in his description, they significantly cut churn and increased productivity. The investments that they made, which were not insignificant, paid off, tenfold. Right. Larry Fink has been very vocal. He's the CEO of BlackRock about, and that's a big money management firm. They have a lot of power because they own 5% of essentially every company in the world, seemingly. But a lot of companies, got the ear of a lot of CEOs, and he talks a lot about purpose in his CEO letters and his annual letters. So those are a couple people that I would look to or point people to who are trying to change. Now, we're in a bit of a fraught time, which maybe makes this discussion even more important because the political environment is not necessarily totally open to this style of change. And what's interesting about Trump is that in some ways he's very much a neoliberal, right? He cares a lot about sort of the oligarch class and sort of the classic way that neoliberals think. On the other hand, he talks like a populist, right? And populism is a part of this sort of worker empowerment and how do we recognize the hollowing out of the middle class. And he talks a lot about the manufacturing base in the U.S. that's moved offshore. I don't think we're going to be able to regain that specifically, but when he's talking about that, he's talking about what happened to the middle class, right? And our irresponsibility as a society of dealing with the repercussions of that, right? Which have led to what we call deaths of despair, right? But there are more people dying today of drug overdoses and opioid overdoses and things like that, and alcoholism, as a direct result of decreased economic opportunity, right? And so I think that he's this sort of kind of interesting figure in this transition because in some ways he's leading or talking about leading us towards something that's maybe a little bit different than what we've experienced today, up to today. On the other hand, some of his policies are very squarely in sort of the neoliberal playbook. So I view that as just sort of like the last gasps of neoliberalism. But whether we move to dynamic capitalism or not is still, I think, an open question. I think one of the reasons we wrote the book was because Elizabeth and I wanted to give it a little bit of a nudge in the right direction.
Well, it sounds like you had access to some amazing people, and I mean, what an incredible journey.
Unbelievable. And it was, I mean, I'll talk about Dan Schulman from PayPal again. We got access to him because I just sent him an email.
Really?
I sent him, he was obviously at his desk because he wrote me back like 5, I explained what we were doing. I knew he was interested in this because I knew the story. And I explained what we were doing, and he wrote me back 5 minutes later and said, I'd love to talk to you.
Wow.
Right? Getting to Jamie was a little bit harder because I didn't have his email, I guess. But you know, I talked to some friends at JP Morgan and said, this is what we're doing. And one of them who was high enough up in the hierarchy was like, I can get a message to Jamie. I think he'd be interested in this. And that's how we got to him, or Dick Parsons, or Lisa Green Hall, or all these interesting people. Yeah, Kate Williams from 1% for the Planet. I mean, all sorts of folks were willing to sit down with us and talk to us about their views of what's working and what's not working in capitalism. We also tell the stories of companies that sort of are on different sides of the political aisle, if you will.
Right.
So we talk about Hobby Lobby. We talk about Chick-fil-A, companies that are maybe a little bit more associated with policies that would be considered, or at least historically considered, Republican. I think those terms, the terminology now, I think is a little bit off, because I think there are a bunch of things that used to be sort of thought of as in the Democratic Party that are now more part of the populist wing of the Republican Party, and a little bit vice versa. And by the way, both parties have these populist wings, which are really interesting, and they've got some of the same challenges in terms of lack of economic mobility and lack of prospects, but they have sort of different ways of describing sort of their grievances, if you will, right? On the right, that sounds like, here's the group of people that are to blame for this, and we should kick them out of the country or not let them in, or whatever it is. And on the left, that sounds more like you've been wronged and you should get all these things for free, rent or college or whatever it is. But they're kind of the same population basis, right? I mean, it's a little bit hard to sort of admit that, but I think that's what you see in polling. Like, there's a surprising number of people that were Obama voters that voted for Trump, right? Or even Biden voters who then voted for Trump. And I think that we ignore these people at our peril, right? We really, there are stories here that are really important for us to both recognize and then ultimately tell, because they are really shaping our current political landscape in ways that are both probably positive and in some ways that are negative as well. And I think that we need to do a better job of at least listening and understanding their stories.
Well, I guess, one word that comes to mind as you were talking about all of this is hope. Like that, and again, we sort of talk about both sides of the political, spectrum, and sort of the complications of sort of how we're all showing up in the world today. To me, as you talk about the future of capitalism, that feels super hopeful to me.
Yeah.
And I just want to show up into a world of hope. And for this under 40 crowd that maybe is not maybe doesn't appreciate, doesn't understand, needs to learn more, as we all probably do, this idea that things can actually get better, and maybe you're evolving in that way. I mean, I don't know if that was intentionally a theme of what you're doing, but that's a takeaway that I have, Seth.
No, I appreciate that. And when we talk about the book, we do describe it as hopeful, right?
Yeah.
It is ultimately a very positive book, because we are Elizabeth and I are both hopeful and optimistic people. And I think maybe we're onto something here, which is that part of, I think, what's happening for people who don't see that potential, right? Don't see that economic prospect for themselves or their families, is that they're lacking that hope, right? Yeah. And when you lack the hope, you look for both people to blame and things to do to fix that. Yes. Right? And you lash out potentially because those things maybe aren't happening. And so I think that the more we can give people real hope, I think the more people will be open to embracing those aspects of capitalism that really work and work at massive scale, and hopefully at least recognize some pieces of capitalism that at least need some guardrails, right? And historically government has provided at least some level of guardrail on capitalism, right? We have rules around clean drinking water, and as as someone in the food business, what you can and can't put into your food products and things like that. All that stuff's important, and those are roles that the government should play. And we're in a little bit of a messy time around that, but I believe that ultimately we'll get through these sort of challenging times, and people will have better economic prospects, and we'll get back to some of sort of what really worked in the U.S., especially from the period after the Second World War through sort of the early 70s, really, which is described as the golden age of capitalism, which we were growing faster than we're growing now, and that growth was shared much more broadly across our economy. And those two things are related.
Wow. All right. So December 9th, the book is coming out. And of course, I have pre-ordered some copies. But for anyone who's learning about this for the first time, where can they get your book?
They can find ways to order it on thecapitalevolution.com, read a little bit more about the book, read some of the endorsements, and there's a bunch of places that they can buy. There are obviously larger places like Barnes & Noble and Amazon, and also smaller shops like my wife's bookstore, Composition Shop.
Great. Well, thank you, Seth. Good luck with the book. It sounds absolutely amazing.
Thanks, Jane. Appreciate it.
Am I the only one whose IQ went up by about 10 points after listening to Seth? Wow. There is so much to unpack here, not limited to Seth's very balanced approach to the current political regime in the U.S. His reflections on that alone are a masterclass on how to see both sides of any situation. My reflection on this interview really centers around two topics that we, as listeners, can action. First, what is our role in capitalism and using that to better the human condition of others? And second, are we hopeful today about the world we want to live in? If the answer is yes, or the answer is no, what are we doing to affect the change we want? Although there are lots of places to buy Seth and Elizabeth's book, please go to compositionshop.com or visit the Composition Shop in downtown Longmont, Colorado, both created by Seth's wife, Greeley Sachs.